Well, here we are at Ilston on the Gower Peninsula, and we can see the place in its glory today. And this is where, in the year 1649, John Myles came to establish the first Baptist church here in Wales. Not quite the first Baptist church, but I'll say something more about that in a moment. In order to understand why he came here, the reasons for it, we need to say something about the background. The 1630s had been a decade of huge tension, growing tension, between the king and the church and the bishops on one side and Parliament on the other. And it came to a head in 1642 when the king declared war on Parliament. From then on, Parliament ruled without the authority of the king. And what Parliament did was to get rid of the established church, the Episcopalian church, pensioned off the bishops. They got rid of the Book of Common Prayer, and religiously this created a vacuum. And into that vacuum came the religion of the sects. We think of the Quakers, we think of the Independents, the Congregationalists, more than one set of Baptists, but they came in to fill the place where the established church had been. It was a time of great liveliness, creativity religiously, where people who had been convicted and convinced by a new form of Christianity, a freer form of Christianity, they put down roots in so many different places. And the place that John Myles put his roots down were here in Ilston on the Gower Peninsula. We think of the Ilston Church, the first Baptist church. In fact, it wasn't the first Baptist church. The first Baptist church had been established in Radnorshire by a Radnorshire man. That was 3 years earlier, Hugh Evans, who'd gone to England, who'd come back, who'd done some evangelistic work, but that was very much ad hoc. What Myles did, he came to lead the London Baptist mission to South Wales in order to plant churches, and not just to plant individual churches, but to plant an association of specifically Calvinistic Baptist churches in fellowship with one another. The first was here in Ilston in 1649. The second was in Hay-on-Wye a few months later. The third was in Glamorgan, in Llanharan, between the Vale of Glamorgan and the uplands of Glamorgan in the same year. A year later, in Carmarthen in West Wales, and then in 1652, the fifth and final church was in Abergavenny in the east. So what you had now was a structure of Baptist churches, well-oiled, well-ministered to, quite hierarchical, but in fellowship with one another. Because for Myles, it wasn't enough just to preach the gospel. Those who had responded to the gospel were called into church order. The idea of fellowship, of church fellowship, was very, very important for Myles and the first Welsh Baptists. Well, who was John Myles? He was born in 1621, and he was born in Newton Clifford in Herefordshire. But in that part of Herefordshire where the Welsh language was spoken, a few miles beyond Hay-on-Wye. We don't know much about his background, the detail of his background, but it would be very surprising were he not have been able to speak Welsh, because that was the context in which he was brought up. He emerges as a 16-year-old lad matriculating in Brasenose College in Oxford, which means that he came from a fairly substantial family background. After that, he disappears in order to re-emerge here in Ilston in 1649, having been sent by the London Particular Baptists to lead this mission to plant churches here in South Wales, the 5 churches of that first association. But as well as being a Baptist and a leading Baptist, he also belonged to the leaders of Welsh Puritanism, people like Vavasor Powell and Morgan Llwyd and Walter Craddock. He was one of the leaders, the signatories, the officers of the Act for the Better Propagation of the Gospel in Wales, which was enacted in 1650 until 1653, when the Parliament, with a lack now of an established church, the Parliament appointed preachers, some of which were roving preachers, peripatetic preachers. Others were settled preachers in order to minister among the people. So after the Act came to an end in 1653, ironically, it seems to us, but Myles was appointed parish lecturer in Llanelli in 1656, and a year later he became the parish minister, the vicar of what was initially the Anglican parish here in Ilston. So on the one hand, he was a Baptist minister. On the other hand, he was the established clergyman here in Ilston. And that's how things would have gone on, I suspect, until Oliver Cromwell, who was the Lord Protector, he passed away. His son Richard took over from him. Richard had no aptitude for politics at all. And then what happened in 1660, the monarchy was restored. People called Charles II back to the throne. The Anglican Church was re-established. The Book of Common Prayer was made compulsory after 1662. And those who could not conform to this new establishment, they either had to function outside of the law or they had to leave. And what happened was, in 1660, the congregation of Ilston relocated to Swansea, and after 1662, 1663, Myles and some of his church members went to Massachusetts, and to re-establish themselves, they left Swansea, Glamorganshire, in order to go to a place that they called Swansea in Massachusetts. And from then on, 1663, until his death in 1683, Myles was in New England. But his most important work was done not in America, not in London, and not in Brasenose College in Oxford. It was done here in South Wales between 1649 and 1652, where he established this network of churches which, despite everything, they perpetuated themselves into the 18th century and the 19th century and the 20th century as well. And that is why we look back to John Myles as being the one who established the Welsh Baptist tradition.